In 2009, when she was elected to the Vermont state legislature, Kesha Ram Hinsdale was the youngest state lawmaker in the country. Now campaigning for United States House of Representatives, she hopes to become the first woman and the first woman of color to represent the state of Vermont.
A progressive voice in the campaign, Hinsdale has pledged not to accept corporate political action committee dollars. Joining us to discuss is State Senator Kesha Ram Hinsdale. Welcome, Kesha.
Thank you so much for having me, and happy President's Day weekend to those watching at home.
Yes, to all those who celebrate President's Day, happy President's Day. And so talk to us about this race. So this was created by the musical chairs of Pat Leahy announcing that he's resigning at the end of this term, retiring, I guess would be a more appropriate way of putting that. Peter Welch, who's been a longtime U.S. House member, in his 70s at least, he's jumping over to the U.S. Senate seat. That's where the senators come from often, is this House seat, which makes this House seat that much more important because it is often a stepping stone to the Senate. So people might assume from afar that Vermont is automatically going to elect a super progressive member to its delegation, but that's not necessarily the state's history. And so what is the race looking like? Who's in it so far?
Well, yeah, I mean, just to start with the additional context that you gave this, Vermont is a brave little state that has often sent someone who changes the national conversation to Washington. You can look at someone like Jim Jeffords, even, who left the Republican Party when President George W. Bush was waging an unjust war, all the way to Bernie Sanders and Senator Patrick Leahy, who has now served for 48 years as he looks at retiring. This lone congressional seat has, as you mentioned, always been held by a male identifying person. And we have the opportunity to send not just a woman to Washington, but someone who continues that progressive legacy of changing the conversation in the country around economic, racial, social, and environmental justice. I am one of 3 women in the race currently. We don't know that that's the end of the field, but certainly I am distinguishing myself as someone who has stood up for climate and environmental justice and for labor, especially when it was difficult.
And so as you look at the national landscape, right now, what issues are you really interested in focusing on in this race? What will be the big issues in this race?
Yeah, I'm running for Congress to be Vermont's fighter for our working families, our democracy, and our climate. Vermont is a small but mighty state that, we have a very strong feeling and sense of our democratic principles. We want to see the rest of the country maintain access to voting rights and the ballot box. We are often increasing things like vote by mail and even all resident voting that allows non-citizens to vote in local elections. So we look around and think, how can Vermont add to the conversation happening in Washington on that front? With climate and environmental justice and tackling climate change, we are home to some great climate thinkers. I'm proud to have the support of Bill McKibben in this race, who founded 350.org, an international movement to focus on reducing the parts per million of our carbon emissions so that we can have a livable planet into the future. Vermonters in our rural landscape think a lot about making sure we have a planet for future generations. And, finally, it's a time coming out of the pandemic, we hope, when our working families are struggling the most, and we need to ensure their stability, safety, and support coming out of this pandemic.
So after Leahy announced his resignation, I did a monologue here where I suggested that Bernie Sanders should really try to stay out of the Senate race so that a Senate race could develop, rather than just immediately endorsing his kind of moderate good friend, Pete Welch. Bernie Sanders did not take my advice, endorsed Peter Welch on the first day of his campaign. And so that basically, froze the Senate race. Peter Welch will be the nominee, and he'll probably, will win the general election without getting too far out on any forecasting limbs here. But Bernie has not weighed in on the House race. And so I'm curious what his role is here, and also in the state, kind of what kind of progressive infrastructure has he built up there, and how does it intersect with and interact with the Democratic Party? Because he always runs in the Democratic primary, and then he does this jujitsu where he drops off the ballot, but then the Democrats agree not to run a Democrat against him so that he maintains his kind of independent label. So, is there a Bernie movement in Vermont that is going to be marshaled to make sure that this seat stays kind of in Democratic Socialist hands, or is Bernie kind of just saying, whoever wins, because one of your leading opponents is Lieutenant Governor Molly Gray, who's very kind of an establishment wing, would be a reliable Democratic vote, but a very establishment Democrat?
Absolutely. I have a really unique lens on the arc of both Congressman Welch and Senator Sanders' career. I joined them on stage in 2006 at the University of Vermont when I was a sophomore to kick off their campaigns for then the congressional seat and the Senate seat in 2006. It feels like ancient history now because they weren't necessarily draws for thousands of people unto themselves. And so they invited a rock star senator from Illinois to also join us on stage. It was the first time I had heard the story of someone with a father from Kenya and a mother from Kansas, myself having a father from India and a mother from Illinois. And, he turned around and said, "Hey, Bernie, if you don't behave yourself, we are going to run Kasia for the Senate instead of you." It was the first time anyone encouraged me to run for office. It was 16 years ago now. And, it was really a moment where the progressive and Democratic parties, which are both existing parties in the state, not just wings of the Democratic Party, truly came together to advance Senator Sanders as the nominee that year. That's not always been the case in Vermont. There's a complicated relationship between moderate Democrats and progressive Democrats and the Progressive Party in Vermont. And it's been a long experiment with making sure that we don't hand our seats over to conservatives or the Republican parties, while we decide what we want to do internally. This Democratic electorate in Vermont is very far to the left. It's a very progressive electorate. So far, Senator Sanders is staying out of the race, which, he kind of broke his usual wait and see mode with Congressman Welch, who has truly paid his dues in many ways for this seat. But I have the support of Senator Nina Turner, a longtime surrogate for Senator Sanders. I have the support of Bernie's daughter, Karina, who's a close friend, and even the woman who made Bernie's mittens for that famous Inauguration Day photo.
You've got the mitten maker. Yeah, if you've got a mitten maker, you're in pretty good shape there. And that Obama story, though, is so classic, though, because you can see him sort of joking, Bernie, better stay in line or else we're going to run Kasia against you, but also not joking. And 14 years later, Bernie stepped out of line and Obama did discipline him. Mm-hmm. He and Jim Clyburn and the rest of them.
You get the mittens of punishment.
Yes, the mittens were brought down.
When I was a college sophomore, I didn't know much about what was going on except, wow, if there's a place for folks like this in politics, there's a place for someone like me. But yes, 16 years has revealed a lot, for sure.
What do you think about the reality that, this is a very favorable environment for the Republicans? They're expected to make, we'll find out, but they're expected to make gains in both chambers of Congress, expected that the House might potentially flip, and then you would be in the minority. How does that change the priorities? Does that dampen the enthusiasm for what the Democratic Party will actually be able to accomplish in the House this time next year?
If it was up to the Republicans, they would be chambers of commerce, and we'd be leaving a lot of working people
Freudian
behind.
Slip on my part.
A bit of a slip, exactly. And I think what's wonderful and unique about Vermont is we have the one congressional seat. We have a small but mighty population that cares so much about democracy and working families and our climate that they will send an absolute fighter to hold the line on these issues, regardless of who has the majority. And frankly, it's one thing to have the majority as Democrats, and it's another to do something with it and truly advance progressive values. I have a history, even in Vermont, which is seen as a fairly liberal or progressive state, of standing with labor, standing on the state house steps as the only state senator with educators and state employees to defend their pensions even when it's hard, even when other Democrats, are saying that is you're choosing between our party and Labor, which should never happen. But I have a history of standing up to anybody, whether it's establishment Democrats or Republicans, and standing up for what's right for Vermonters and hopefully now for Americans.
And real quickly, how does the Republican side look in this primary? Because I'm convinced that we're going to see some real surprises on election night in November, and that Democrats are going to lose in some places, whether it's Washington State or Colorado, or where you really would not have expected them to. Are they running a serious candidate, and are you at all concerned that there's so much frustration out there that even Vermont might be in play for Republicans?
So far, it's incredibly quiet and sleepy on the Republican side of this race. There is one candidate who is a bit of a perennial candidate from city council races in our largest city, Burlington, to, some larger regional races, but who has, very little star power within the Republican Party. In fact, we do have a Republican governor, as some folks may not know, who was the only person who got more votes in 2020 than President Biden in Vermont. And, he's quite popular in his role. He has expressed no interest in going to Washington. And for star power on their side, we were all surprised to see that former U.S. Attorney Christina Nolan jumped into the Senate race against Congressman Welch. I don't think that Vermonters are going to choose a Republican for the Senate nor Congress, knowing what's at stake, but certainly something to pay attention to and always make sure that we're doing our best to reflect the needs and desires of all Vermonters to the best of our ability. We are also the state that voted for Trump in the lowest numbers in the country. So really, no risk, I think, of too vitriolic a debate.
Well, Kesha, thanks so much for joining us.
Thank you for having me. It's been a pleasure.
And we'll have more Rising right after this.